Welcome to Saturday's Warrior. Tonight we've got a special guest with us. We got Bronco Bleymaier of the YouTube channel of the same name. He does some excellent, very in-depth analysis on Boise State football and some really good interviews. For example, his latest video was with former Boise State quarterback Grant Hendrick. It was excellent stuff, and he is almost, last I checked, almost at the 1,000 subscriber mark. So please be sure to, after watching this, go check out his channel. I'll put the link in the description, and be sure to subscribe to his channel. But yeah, we're really grateful to have you on. Thanks so much, and welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. It's awesome to be on the show. You're right. I think I'm 3 subscribers away right now from 1,000. So just if 3 of you take a second, go to the channel, hit the subscribe, come back. That would be awesome. But thanks so much for being here. I'm really excited. I do love talking college football. It's not just Boise State. Really West Coast heavy focus with me, mostly the Mountain West. I took some Pac-12. I've talked BYU quite a bit in the channel, especially when they played Boise State, but in the past separately as well. So I love focusing on anything Mountain West, West Coast, Boise State football. So please make sure you hit that subscribe button. Also, I would love to just give a shout out to the True Blue BYU Cougar fan club. It's a friend of mine who started that BYU Facebook group. So I had to give him a shout out on the show. But thanks so much for having me on. I'm excited to talk some Mountain West football, some conference realignment, whatever we got going on today.
Great, thanks. So we mentioned you're almost at that 1,000 subscriber mark. You just had your birthday this week, you mentioned in your video. And then I saw also that you are a new father. So is it your first?
Second, but first boys.
Okay, first boy. So a lot of major milestones you just hit. Which one is your favorite, or which one are you most proud of?
You know what? I think my wife's going to watch this video, so we'll say no, I'm just kidding. Birth of my son, obviously, I'm excited about. The birthdays get less and less exciting as you go peak past 25. So we'll leave that one behind. But yeah, the birth of my son's number one, and then that subscriber count getting to 1,000 be a close second.
A close second. Good. Well, that was a softball, so I'm glad you got that one right. So anyway, so as we know, there's been tons of realignment. BYU is on its way to the Big 12, which means its rivalry with Boise State is coming to an end, at least in terms of playing each other every year and for the foreseeable future. So I'd like to, what are your thoughts on the BYU and Boise State rivalry over the years and it coming to an end?
Well, I did a whole separate video talking about this and why we need to keep the Boise State versus BYU rivalry going, because I do think that it's one of the best, if not the best, modern rivalry in college football. And you talk about a lot of rivalries that have been going back hundreds of years, or not hundreds of years, but decades. And obviously this rivalry doesn't compete with those. But when you talk about new rivalries that have been created, the Boise State versus BYU rivalry is one of the best out there. There have been so many close games. So far, rivalry stands right now at 8-5. Boise State owning that record overall, but BYU getting the win last time they played. And that's how it's been. It's been back and forth, back and forth. There's been 6 games with less than a 10-point victory margin. There's only been 2 games that were blowouts, and 2 of the games were won by less than 1 point. I remember one of the games when I was in college, I believe it was the 2017 game or the 2018 game that I actually had a test the next day, and this game kicked off at like 10:30 p.m. And so I was like, well, you know what? I guess I'm showing up to the test with 3 hours of sleep, and that was that game that just went right to the wire. And that's just how it's been with Boise State versus BYU. So I'm really sad to see the rivalry go. I would love to see it continue. There's multiple reasons I could bring up if we have time to go into them why I think we should keep it going. But the big statement overall here is that it's been one of the best, and I wish it would continue.
Yeah, I've really loved it. I like your point in terms of modern rivalries, because it's one that that I felt like kind of solidified itself as a true rivalry pretty quickly. It wasn't just 2 teams playing each other that I felt like there was a fair amount of animosity, but like the healthy kind, not like the BYU Utah kind. It felt very felt respectful and very competitive. The unranked team has upset the ranked team during this rivalry, which really helped solidify that. And I lived in Boise when this rivalry started. I got to go to the very first match where it was the 7-6, which as boring as that sounds, that was one of the most intense games I've ever been to, and a lot of fun. And so, yeah, it definitely is sad. It's sad to see this fun rivalry kind of close this chapter.
Well, you mentioned that 7-6 game, and I think that epitomizes what this rivalry is all about because you had Taysom Hill there as a quarterback for BYU, and that's why this rivalry is so intense because Taysom Hill, he's an Idaho kid. You know, these two schools, they're close to each other geographically. They recruit a lot of the same players. We're going to talk about, I think, a little bit later on. There's a couple of Boise State players that are going over to BYU. We've had BYU players come up to Boise State, transferring over. Same recruits, putting them number one, number two, end up going one school or the other. When it comes to denominations, there's a lot of Mormon fans for both Boise State and BYU, a lot of LDS on the team as well. And there's just this great combination of cultures that there's a meshing point there. And then you end up having these families almost like house divided against each other. It's a rivalry that's naturally built right there in the making. And it's had some impressive matchups like that 7-6 game or the most recent game where, that was a 3-point win there by BYU. And you're right, unranked teams beating ranked teams. Last year, BYU coming up and upsetting Boise State. And then the year before that, Boise State beating a top 10 BYU team that was on their way to the playoffs. You know, I think you look at that game, BYU wins against Boise State. Maybe they come in a little bit more motivated versus Baylor. Undefeated team, Big 12 bound. You have to look at them as an undefeated team, look at them as a playoff contender. You look at that 2019 game. When we talk about ramifications, what these games have meant and how it's built the rivalry. 2019 game, Boise State comes in to play BYU, fresh off of a quarterback rotation there. Hank Bachmeier injured, Jalen Henderson stepping up to the bat. Brand new quarterback for Boise State, but it still comes down to the wire. Boise State loses that game. It's the only game prior to the bowl game they lose that year. They'd have been undefeated. They would have been in the New Year's Six, and BYU took that away from them, just like we took the playoff spot away from BYU. That is why this rivalry has been so intense. It's a shame to see it go. I kind of tongue-in-cheek said that it was the best rivalry that either team has, and I gave some reasons why it was better than Utah versus Utah and Utah State. Obviously, I think probably Utah versus BYU is a better rivalry because historic and being in the same state. But there, you look at this rivalry, there are a ton of reasons to keep it. Not a lot of reasons to let it go. BYU's joining the Big 12, which is a great move up for them. But this is not the SEC. It's not the Big 10. They don't have the East Coast bias carrying them. They still need to schedule strong out-of-conference opponents. And that's getting harder and harder as more conferences in the Power 5 look to schedule teams within their own conferences, like the ACC and the Big 10 and even the SEC are doing. So Boise State is a match made in heaven. They're always going to be a strong team. A win against them looks good. A loss against them doesn't look that bad. They're a Power 5 team inside of the Group of 5. You know, you don't look at them as a typical Group of 5 team. It makes sense for the rivalry to go on. And I know both fan bases want it to. I just don't understand why it's coming to a close.
Well, so during independence, BYU, you know, the scheduling, you know, was all over the place, but really they had to front load everything. And it wasn't until, you know, week 10 or 11 that they finally get a bye week and to play a cupcake game, because that's the only time you could get someone to come to Provo in November, right? And so they just completely beat up all season. And now we have a bye week, I think, I want to say week 5, but it's in the middle of the season. And we get to start off with a couple cupcakes, figure out some of the new, you know, we'll have a lot of new players, new defensive coaching staff, and really kind of to get some playing time, some reps under our belt. And so I think that, you know, that's something that BYU hasn't had. And so playing Boise State regularly, using one of those 3 out of conference games, which is not going to be a gimme by any stretch of the imagination. I understand, you know, it's happened with Utah, did it too. They're like, hey, BYU, we want to play you most years, but we also want to schedule some other people, but we can't have a crazy difficult out of conference schedule as well. And so I don't like it, but it's the reality of it. And so, you know, I don't see any reason why down the road, I think BYU scheduled out a bit, but down the road, why Boise State couldn't be one of those tougher out of conference games of those 3. And I hope they do. And really, we'll get more into this, but really, I'd just like to see them be in conference games. It'd be even better.
Yeah, obviously, Boise State to the Power 5, the Big 12, Pac-12, whatever you have, has always been a goal for the program. And it seems like Boise State's been on the edge of every conference realignment talk going back the last decade. And they always end up being the one just left outside the dance. But yeah, moving up to the Big 12 would be a great move for this program, for Boise State. And I got some reasons to go into why I think they'd be a great addition as well, if you wanted to touch those.
Yeah, actually I do. Why is it, first, that you think, because it was, I want to say 6, 7 months ago, that the whole talk was the first four out of the Big 12 and of the P5 status was Boise State, SMU, Memphis, and South Florida. And it was consistently those four. It's like really nobody else. Then all of a sudden it's San Diego State and maybe SMU, and nobody else is being talked about. It's so funny how that happened in such a short time, that complete switch. So what is it that you think has kind of knocked Boise State out of that conversation?
Well, I'm not 100% convinced they were ever in that conversation. I mean, a big part of that is the new conference leadership. You have a new conference head for the Big 12 come in, and I think he's come in with a little bit of a different goal, a little bit of a different focus. He wants to make the Big 12 the SEC and the Big 10. The way that you do that is you start making yourself exclusive. You start associating yourself with the teams that you want to be like, or the conferences that you want to be like. And the SEC and the Big 10 are starting to have these rules where you can only play a certain amount of group of fives, or you got to play a certain amount of people in conference. You got to schedule a certain amount of power fives. And they're trying to replicate that because that's what the big conferences is doing. I mean, honestly, what the SEC and the Big 10 do, the rest of college football follows. Remember, it was the Big 10 that got college football back into action in 2020 when nobody was going to play. The Big 10 was like, you know what, we're going to play a few games. The rest of college football was like, okay, yeah, you know what, we'll play too. And then you had that limited COVID season for 2020 football. So I think that's just a matter of course. Whatever those big conferences do, they're going to try and copy. So, I think there was a point where they were looking at adding some more desirable group of five teams, moving them up. And now at this point, with the Pac-12 uncertainty, the fact that, I mean, it looks like it might be on its last legs right now, they want to save room for a flood of Pac-12 teams coming over, while at the same time, at least ideologically, associating themselves with that Power 5 dogma. Obviously, the thing that holds Boise State back is always the TV market. The fact that it's in a somewhat remote location comparatively, that Boise City is not that big, and that Idaho is not that populated. But again, I think that is a mistake. I think that is a backwards way of looking at TV markets. Maybe back in the 70s or the 50s or whatever, when you had only a few games on TV and people were watching all your games on television. And so you wanted television sets in your conference. That's what your main goal was. Now in the digital age, people are watching on streaming cutting services like YouTube TV or Hulu Plus. They're watching from other, there's Tubio and all these other ways that you can watch games, ESPN Plus, without even ever being connected to any kind of TV network. So the idea of how many viewers you're going to get is dictated by the people in your footprint is completely ridiculous. Now it's about brands. It's about what kind of national brand you bring to the table. That's why Boise State averaged over 700,000 views last year, close to 800,000 views, according to school metrics. Even the most conservative estimates had Boise State close to 400,000 views from non-school estimates. They were the top viewed over the last 6 years. They're the top viewed team. Last 2 years here, they're the top viewed team outside of the academy schools and the teams already on their way to the Power 5 out of the group of five there. They're actually number 6 right now, only behind BYU, Cincinnati, Army, UCF, and Navy as far as most views of the last few years. And if you go back farther in the statistics, it continues to dig up the same numbers because Boise State has the brand. They have the blue turf. They have the winning records. They have the Fiesta Bowl wins. They have that history, and it draws in viewers. But unfortunately, most conferences are run by people who probably wouldn't know how to understand a smartphone, and they view the metrics through this old age way of looking at things, and it's going to hurt them in the long run, as well as keep teams like Boise State out of the markets.
Yeah, no, I agree with you because we see with the Big Ten, the way they're going and the focus on their expansion, it's all about brands, right? Because before their previous round, well, I would say Nebraska was about getting a brand, but then after that, they got Rutgers and Maryland, and they were pretty blatant as to why. It was strictly about getting eyeballs because they were launching the Big Ten network, and they really wanted to grow that. But now, whenever you hear about Big Ten expansion or even SEC, it's all about brands and who are those biggest brands that get in there. And I think Boise State is one of those biggest brands. Like you can make a case for, a San Diego State or somebody else that's in some of these larger markets, but does SMU carry Dallas necessarily? And so yeah, I agree with you there. I think that's a little bit short-sighted and boxing it in like that, but I hope that changes. So why? So I mean, you kind of already did, but make the case for Boise State really being in a P5 and where you see them being the best fit. Would it be the Pac-12 or the Big 12 or somewhere else?
Well, I'll say right off the bat, I think the Big 12 is the goal. You know, the Pac-12, it's limited by what its capabilities are because it's so far on the West Coast. When you talk about East Coast bias, and I'll define that term because some people don't know what it means, but East Coast bias is the fact that you have so many eyeballs on the East Coast. So you have a larger population of the East Coast team. So the Big Ten to a certain amount because they're kind of that midway point gets to benefit from that. SEC, ACC, those schools, they get more viewership because they have more population centers. The second thing is that your games are on earlier in the day. You want to watch a Pac-12 versus Pac-12 team, if you'll get lucky if it's on a major carrier. And the second thing is it's probably going to be at like 8 p.m. at night. And that's for Pac-12. You want to watch a Mountain West game, 10:30 p.m. on the East Coast versus for a American athletic team, they're going to be on at worst like 3 or 4 p.m. So you're going to get a lot more viewers. So you get a lot more national recognition. The pollsters, there's a lot of people across the country that are ranking these teams, either in the AP poll or in the CFP. They're not watching all these games. They're not watching every team. And the Mountain West and the Pac-12 end up hurting because they're not part of that East Coast factor where you have earlier time slots and more viewers on your screens. So that's a big factor against teams on the West Coast, and it hurts them, and the Pac-12 hurts from that. And then the other factor is that the Pac-12 is just one of the worst run conferences in the entire country. I mean, they are absolute academic elitists. That's all they care about is their academic brand. You know, that's great when you're running a school or institution, but when you're running a conference, it's got to be about sports, and specifically, it's got to be about football and what you're able to add to your marketability as a football conference. The Pac-12 doesn't care about that. Boise State is never going to get an invite to the Pac-12 because they just don't have the academic ratings. Big 12, however, they have their focus in the right spot. They know it's about football. They're bringing in teams that are going to add to the football brand. They understand the value of not just national geographic locations and what they bring, but also national revenues and national streams. It doesn't matter about if you're close to the Big 12, bringing a school like Cincinnati, because you know that they're going to add a watchability that other schools closer to you, maybe Four Corner School, wouldn't over them. And so I think that the Big 12 is definitely a place I would like to see Boise State. And as far as a case for Boise State being added, we talked about that massive national media market, 800,000 views as a G5 team. Now, even another school in the group of five that's not already on their way to the Power Five that does that. I mean, it's unheard of. And that's because people will watch a game at Boise. It doesn't matter who they're playing. They'll watch a game for Boise State because they want to see the blue field. So they'll turn it on and they'll view it and they'll watch the game for Boise State. The fact is, Boise State also, they know they play well at the national stage. So when they play a Power Five team, people are going to view that in storms. The game versus Oklahoma State in 2021 drew close to 2 million viewers because it was such a large game. It was a Power Five game on the blue field. You combine both presences together. You also add the fact that they are a national brand. They have the marketability. They have the Fiesta Bowl wins. They have the blue turf. They have the wins. They have the culture that they have established. No matter where you go in the country, I've been on the East Coast and I've gone to Boise State games. I went to the Boise State versus UVA game. There were more Boise State fans at that game than there were UVA fans by halftime. And it wasn't just because UVA was sucking. It was also because Boise State fans showed up in droves. They show up no matter where they play because they have a large national market. It's not just about Boise. It's not just about Idaho. You have fans across the country. You go anywhere in the country and you say, hey, let's talk about La Tech. Let's talk about, Fresno State. Let's talk about Hawaii. They don't know anything about those teams, and they don't have an opinion on them if they do know about them. You talk about Boise State, everybody has an opinion on Boise State. They either hate them or they love them. They either hate the blue turf or they hate the blue turf, but they know about us, and they're talking about us, and they bring a national presence that other teams don't. Then other factors for joining the Big 12, and I know I'm kind of getting windy here, but I'll wind up here in just a second, is the natural rivalries. Boise State to the Big 12 just makes sense. First off, it's a great travel partner for BYU. BYU is on the end of nowhere right now if they don't have Boise State setting up for them. I think their closest team is Texas Tech, which is, I had it written down. I'm kind of stumbling here, but, Texas Tech is a long way away. So the closest team that they've got to BYU is Texas Tech, so it adds a natural travel partner for BYU. And then you have the rivalry with BYU. You also have a rivalry versus TCU. That's an old Mountain West foe. Boise State's met them several times at high level, Poinsettia Bowl, Fiesta Bowls. There's a deep hatred between those two schools. Boise State versus UCF. They've only played each other a couple of times, once in 2021, and they're going to play again here in 2023. But they've been natural rivals because they've been the rivals for that New Year's Six spot already. So when I went to that UCF game that they played at, Boise State played at UCF, their fans were chanting "F you," but actually saying the word. And I talked to their fans. I said, "Is this normal?" And they're like, "No, not really. Usually, this is only reserved for rivals that we treat fans like this, you know." And they were doing that because there's a natural rivalry. Boise State versus Oklahoma State is a rivalry in the making. There's been some really close games, some really great games there. And then really it's Boise State versus anybody. You go up there and you play on the blue turf. Boise State plays with a fire and a passion. They bring another level to the game. There's a factor there that you would get more viewers for Boise State versus anyone in the Big 12 than you would get for UCF versus anybody in the Big 12 because it's Boise State, because they bring more viewers. Boise State is drawing in 800,000 viewers in the group of five. Imagine what they could do with actual meaningful games at the Power 5 level. So that's my pitch, but there's so many reasons to say yes to Boise State.
Yeah, no, and I'm totally on board with you. Like I said, I wouldn't consider myself a Boise State fan, but I love to have that rivalry intact. I love Boise State around. I love what they've done for college football. I remember sitting there watching, that Fiesta Bowl against Oklahoma, and going back and rewatching, the condensed version of those games. And so you make an interesting point. I want to go back to, you talked about the TV ratings, and I think sometimes the perspective is short-sighted because a lot of times people are looking at, well, what are you doing now, and not really seeing the possibilities going forward. Well, yeah, this is Boise State now. Put them in a Power 5, put with additional resources, additional money, that what they can do with it. So you'd mentioned that they were coming in number 6 in terms of viewership and in terms of G5. Do you know what those were before those Big 12 invites went out? Did those 4 schools, the 4 new Big 12 schools, jump in viewership after the invite? So, I mean, it goes to show, I mean, now Boise State, instead of playing New Mexico, they're playing Oklahoma State, in these matchups. And so I think that, you can kind of extrapolate how that would play out, being put in that different situation. So I'm totally with you there. And so, but the reality is they may not get that invite, at least not in the near term. Pac-12 may get a decent enough deal together, may stay together, and it may be 5 or so years down the road before the next wave of realignment hits. So what is kind of the best path for Boise State going forward, and kind of the Mountain West as a whole? Is it with Boise State, or does Boise State look for other avenues, or what are your options?
Well, I agree with you. I don't think the Pac-12 is going to invite Boise State unless they are in an absolute desperation mode where, say, the Big Ten picks off, Oregon and Washington, and now they're just forced to accept a swath of teams. That's the only realistic idea I could see of Boise State moving up to Pac-12. And then you have to ask, is that still a Power 5 conference at that point? So I don't think that they're going to be included in this next round of expansion, and I'm not sure they'll be included in the next couple rounds of expansion in this unfortunate situation. So what's the path forward for Boise State? Well, obviously you've got kind of 3 options in front of you. You can stay in the Mountain West, you can go independent, or you can try and join the American Athletic Conference. There's pros and cons to each of these. Obviously, staying in the Mountain West, you've already seen stability. It's what you know. You've got that new conference leadership there with Gloria Nevarez, so maybe things will go in a different direction. We'll have to see how the conference handles San Diego State potentially leaving. But I just, the video that I just did talked about that possibility and what is in the future of the Mountain West. And I said in that video, I don't see the Mountain West adding the teams that they need to add. I see them staying stagnant, staying at 11 members football-wise, 10 members basketball, because Hawaii is just a football affiliate, and eventually being taken over, more teams leaving in the next 10 years. Mountain West doesn't exist anymore. I definitely see that happening if the teams don't get added that need to be added. So what's the path forward for Boise State? Well, I don't think independence is on the table. I think, maybe it was at one point, but the way college football is going, it's getting tougher and harder to go independent. I think we're going to talk at another date about Liberty and their independent status and what that would have done. I think there were some positives to that. But for a team to go from a conference to independence, especially a conference of the status of the Mountain West, where it's a good group of 5, just doesn't make sense. So many teams are closing themselves off to other schools being able to be added, like we talked about earlier, or being able to play other schools outside of your conference or outside of the Power 5. And the fan base doesn't want it, and the administration doesn't want it. I've done multiple polls on the Bronco Nation Updates Facebook Facebook group talking about, hey, what does independence look like? Do we want to go there? And never has been a majority of fans want the independent road. It takes a very special athletic director, which BYU has, to be able to run the independence gauntlet and do it well. And I respect BYU for what they've been able to do, but it takes a very unique individual to be able to run that program. BYU's gotten lucky, but there's not a lot of athletic directors out there who can do that. So honestly, I think the best bet is the American Athletic Conference. They're a conference that wants to be American. They don't want to just be East Coast. They're already trying to expand their borders. They already tried to add Boise State a few years back when they were the Big East before. I think that opportunity would be available in the future. I think we should, wait a couple of years, see how they work out with this new alignment. But the American Athletic Conference, they have leadership, and that's what matters. They turned the American Athletic Conference from probably the worst conference in college football post the expiration of the Big East to what is regarded as the best Group of Five conference. And that's another discussion for another day. I don't think they are the best. I think the Mountain West holds that title, but they are viewed as the best conference, and that is because of their leadership. They have people in their conference, supported by the conference, that go out and say UCF is a national champion. But they're obviously not, but the conference supports that because they know what it's all about. It's not about what you actually do anymore. And maybe it's a sad state of affairs in America, but especially in college football, it's not about what you do. It's about the brand that you sell. You sell yourself as a national champion. You say, we did this and it equaled this, and we are going to sell ourselves. We're going to create an image. We're going to create an identity, create a brand that people latch onto. Maybe they laugh at you, but that negative publicity is still publicity, and you build yourself up as a conference. They took the world by storm. They rode that East Coast bias, and they have the leadership that is going to support their teams. The Mountain West does nothing to advocate for and support the teams in their conference, especially under Craig Thompson. We'll have to see what happens with Gordon Navarez, but they've done nothing to advocate for their team. So American Athletic Conference is a good way to go. I could definitely see, if no Power 5 invite ends up coming in the next 5 years, I could see Boise State trying to join that. The biggest holdup is going to be the athletic director, Jeremiah Dickey, who is an incredible athletic director for Boise State. And he is doing an incredible job. But he has stated that he doesn't want Boise State playing East Coast teams. He doesn't see Boise State playing east of the Mississippi as a benefit for the program. He canceled the Michigan State game. He is focusing on the West Coast. I think he eyes the Big 12 and Pac-12 as better expansion candidates potentially down the road, but he doesn't see any potential bonus from playing in the East. So I don't think that while Boise State's under his control, that we're going to end up going to the American Athletic Conference. And I'll say this, Jeremiah Dickey is so incredible that if that's what he wants to do, I'm fine with that. I'd rather have him at the head and us not be in the American Athletic Conference than us be in the American Athletic Conference but not have Jeremiah Dickey. But say down the road he ends up going to another school. USC already tried to grab him, with some interview discussions. Down the road, if he ends up going and another athletic director comes in, I could see that as a potential down the road for Boise State to end up join the American.
Yeah, so Mountain West, at least during the BCS era, was always by far the best non-P6 conference. In fact, they were usually better than the Big East and maybe on par with the ACC at the time. And obviously some of that is shifted a little bit, but yeah, the American it was a fun brand. And I think a big difference between them and the Mountain West, you talked about the conference helping, publicize its teams, but also it's just availability, accessibility to watch the games, and so I felt like they were so much easier. They're usually on ESPN on a Friday night or something, and you could watch those games and get familiar with it. And just kind of, they're usually pretty entertaining matchup, even if it was ECU and Tulane or whatever, two teams you wouldn't normally watch. And now look at Tulane, beating USC in a New Year's Six bowl game. So yeah, absolutely. It is a shame because being a BYU fan, I've been there where you're kind of in that bucket of the best of the rest, and you're kind of a tweener. You're stuck in the G5, but really capable of being in the P5 ranks. And so every time, during 2016, I was really wanting it to be BYU, Boise State that they took. And this last round, I was really disappointed when Boise State wasn't one of those teams. And so, I see that Boise State, you'd mentioned UCF, you got them on your schedule this year. It's going to be a big matchup. I'm actually pulling for Boise State because I'd really like BYU to do better than the other three new schools. I know that sounds petty. We should all be pulling for each other. We're in the same conference, but I'd like BYU to pull out and relative to the other newcomers in the conference. So good luck there. But speaking of actual football, so transfer portal is very busy, and BYU has picked up a couple of Boise State players. We have Isaiah Bagna. Is that how you pronounce it? I need to get used to saying. Sorry, how was that?
Banya, like the G is kind
Oh, Banya, that's right. I've heard it, and I always forget. Okay, who is going to be who is a well needed presence on our defense, and then Will Farron, which we have no kicking from what I understand right now. We're kind of like that. We mentioned that 7-6 Boise State BYU game. It's going to be like that again, where every time you're going for it on fourth down because there's no kicking. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on these two players and how they're going to help BYU.
Well, first off, starting with Isaiah Banya, he is one of my favorite players that was on this Boise State team when you took a look at the transfer portal market. And even before when he was on the program, I loved him on this defense. He played with a passion and energy and a fire. I was really disappointed to find out that he was transferring. I understood it. I had a conversation with some people close to him at the UCF game, and they talked about how he wasn't happy with the playing time that he was looking at, the way he was being mixed into the position groups. And that ended up playing out the rest of that 2021 season. And he was, they put him in a kind of like situational packages, but he wasn't that main starting threat. And I think he had that potential, that capability. And I think he believes he has that potential. He's 6'4". He's a big guy. And I think he thought that he was a starter, and he never got those starting looks. And he really wasn't playing much at all in 2022. So I understand why he ended up making this move. I think that if he stuck around, I think he could have been one of those starters this year. We've lost some guys, and there were some opportunities there on the defensive side of the ball, especially in that DN spot where they moved him to. But he also had been in a position where he should have been the starter before and didn't get it. So maybe he thought, hey, go to BYU, have a chance to maybe make something for myself at a different level. So you guys are getting a great player. He was second on the team in sacks in 2021. He had 6 sacks. He had 36 tackles. 6 of those were sacks. I think he had the most quarterback hurries on the team as well. When you put him on the field, he has a nose for the quarterback. He is going to get to them. That UCF game, we put him in. He was a game changer there for us. Obviously, ended up losing that UCF game, but when he was on the field, it was a different level of pressure and on the UCF quarterback, which really we weren't seeing when he was off the field. So you guys are getting a great player there in Isaiah Banya. I'm excited for him. Talking about Will Farron, a little bit more of an unknown. He's newer guy. It was a Boise State. He didn't really play much. He had 2 punts versus Fresno State when they were looking at if they needed to make a change with Ferguson. But then Ferguson really turned his game around there for Boise State and played so much better the rest of the season. One of the most improved players on the team for Boise State, our punter there. So I think it was just a situation of looking at the roster and saying, Ferguson's a freshman. He's going to be here the same amount of time as I am. They've chosen him. They're going with him. As a backup punter, how much playing time are you going to get? I had a cousin who was backup punter. I think he punted once for Oklahoma State. So, you're going to have a level of, you want to play at the top level. BYU doesn't have as many players fighting for that roster spot. Maybe there's a chance to go play at an elite level in the Power 5. Take that move. It's a good move for him because he wasn't going to get much playing time at Boise State. He only had 2 punts for Boise State versus Fresno State, averaged 35.5, long of 36. I don't think that's reflective of what he's capable of. It was a close punting battle there, really to see preseason and also during the season who would take the lead. So I think he has a lot better potential than maybe what he showed at Boise State down the road. But a little bit more of an unknown, but you guys are getting a heck of an athlete with Banya. He's going to be if you guys use him the right way, I think you're going to get a lot out of him.
Well, our defense, I'm not sure how familiar you were with it, but was just not aggressive, was not attacking the quarterback. And whereas the new defensive coordinator is about that, from what I understand. And so it sounds like he'll fit in great with, and I think in terms of stats in FBS, I think we were near the bottom in terms of sacks last year. And so we'd love to see that change and get back to, how BYU defense used to be, a little more aggressive. In terms of Farron, I think he's coming in to compete for place kicking, and our punter is pretty solid. Rico, not to be confused with Uncle Rico, but he has that locked down. But our kicker, Jake Oldroyd, left, and he was very solid for most of his career, fought some injuries, but he's gone now. And so that's really where we need help. And from what I understand during training camp and everything, spring, it was it was not good. Nobody was doing much. So hopefully he can come in, and as an unknown, it doesn't sound like it could be any worse than we currently are. So
He has a
uh,
strong leg. He was the primary place kicker for us. He primarily holding the kickoffs, so he has a strong leg and a strong potential there. We haven't really seen. We have such an incredible kicker right now, probably one of the best in our history for Boise State. So he also wasn't going to unseat him. So I can see him going to BYU, where it seems like there's a better opportunity.
hmm. Well, that's good. That fills me with a little bit of hope. But I'll let um, what if you have any other thoughts on BYU, Boise State, or Boise State in general that you'd like to fill in that we didn't cover.
I mean, just the big one is love to see that rivalry reinstated. It's a great one for both fans. We were even at one point I was talking with one of the heads of the larger BYU Facebook groups, and we were going to try and create some kind of rivalry trophy for this because it felt like it was headed in that direction and it needed one. And then that was right around the same time that BYU got the invite to the Big 12 and said, "Yeah, we're not going to play Boise State anymore." So, or not in the near future. We're going to discontinue this rivalry. So it's definitely one that needs to keep going. I mean, there's 1,000 reasons Boise State to the Power Five, but if it never happens, we got to reinstate this rivalry because it's a great non-conference game for both teams. It's a great revenue generator for both programs, and it's honestly, when you talk about the recruiting impact, it's huge for both programs as well. So definitely one that needs to be kept going from both a Boise State and a BYU perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. It did feel like it probably could have had a trophy at some point. Not sure what that would have been. That'd be an interesting conversation. Unfortunately, it's a moot point, but hopefully, one thing I thought about is that they can continue to schedule each other, at least in other sports, men's and women's basketball, baseball. I don't know what other, wherever they overlap, and try to at least keep that rivalry together on some level. Not the same as playing in football, but maybe continuing that relationship. But yeah, anyway, well, thanks again. This has been tons of fun. Very interesting stuff. Love to hear the Boise State perspective. Like I said, really have loved that rivalry and that relationship between BYU and Boise State, and feel like we've both been kind of on the outside looking in for a long time. And so sad to see that they're not making this jump to the Big 12 together. But so if you want to go plug your stuff, all your socials, your channel, and everything.
Yeah, like I said, Bronco Bleymaier. So YouTube, big one. Like I said, only 3 subscribers away from that 1,000 mark. I also have Twitter under the same handle, Bronco Bleymaier. Bronco Nation Updates, largest Boise State Facebook group. If you're not currently on it, hopefully you maybe found the video from that Facebook group. But we just passed 15,000 members, so big Facebook group for Boise State fans. And then my friend, the Blue BYU Cougar fan club for BYU fans, recently started a Facebook group trying to create a BYU community there as well. So make sure you join that. And I'll end this video as I end my videos on my channel. Go Big Blue!